there was an interesting piece of legislation that was signed into law, I believe on the 18th of this week. I think it was Wednesday evening by our president. And it's called the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And I got to tell you, I read the actual legislation. You know me, I'm a nerd. I like to read the actual law. And it had a lot of language in there that I didn't quite understand. So I began looking for some experts who could help explain this to me and to you, the listeners. And I got to tell you, I read probably over 25 articles. And I came across an article that was sent to me by a colleague of our guest today. Kathryn Cimera is on the show with us, and she's joining us from home. So you're going to hear some things in the background with her family, as most of our country is dealing with remote work at this point. So you can hear some things. Kathryn's joined us today. That's okay. But Kathryn's joined us on the podcast today to help explain this Families First Coronavirus Response Act. Let me tell you a little bit about Kathryn. She is an attorney. Now, because she's an attorney, I'm going to make a statement that she is not offering legal advice here, and she'll probably say the same thing. This is not legal advice. This is educational purposes only. And we're dealing with a very fluid situation, a situation that none of us have dealt with before. So the information that's shared today may change a little bit over the next coming weeks. So with that introduction, Kathryn, I am so humbled and grateful that you joined us today on the podcast.
Thanks, Justin. It's great to be here, and I hope that people can find some comfort in the fact that they are not alone and everyone is dealing with this very difficult situation, and how to kind of figure out a way to continue with providing a service that you do with your business and how to also take care of your employees.
So one of the things that I love about you, Kathryn, is that you have been an attorney practicing employment law for employers for over 20 years now. And so you work with people like me, the business owners, day in, day out. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes, I've always been on the employer side, helping employees navigate employee issues that come up.
So let's dive, if you will, and I'm going to turn this kind of over to you, Kathryn, because I'm not the expert you are in this particular situation. Let's dive head deep into this Families First Coronavirus Response Act. Where do we even start with this particular piece of legislation?
Well, I think the best thing to do is to kind of break it down, because the act itself was dealing with several different issues within it that really are not necessarily applicable to employers today. So if we break it down specifically to what an employer has to deal with, we're looking at two primary provisions, and that is that it created an Emergency Family Medical Leave Act portion, and it also created an emergency paid sick leave. Now, I believe that the intent was to help employees in the sense that for some employees, they were very nervous that they were going to be losing their jobs and they would have no way to stay home. And the idea was we need to have people stay home and not infect other people. So my thinking is we need to make sure that people don't make the choice, I'm either going to get paid or I go to work and potentially infect people. So I don't think anybody who signed this law or worked on this law would say it's a great law, we did everything that we needed to do, but it's an emergency situation and they did what they thought was best at the time. Now, we also can't look at it in isolation. It's all we have today, but the Senate is currently working on another aid package that is supposed to sort of work in conjunction with this act. And I expect that we'll see lots of legislation in the upcoming days that is supposed to sort of walk hand in hand with this to enable employers to continue and to also give a safety net for employees.
So perhaps the biggest question that I've received through the Financially Simple Financially Simple blog, and friends, please, if you have any questions, go to financiallysimple.com/ask Justin, because it helps me when I decipher these questions to find expert guests like Kathryn here on the show today. So again, financiallysimple.com/ask Justin. Kathryn, the biggest question I'm getting, and I'm talking about over 1,000 different responses that have come in the last 3 days. It's amazing how hungry our business owners are for this one question. What I'm being told, Kathryn, is they say, Justin, I love my team. I'm concerned about my team. How does this law help my team? How can I keep them employed, or should I keep them employed? Should I terminate them so they have unemployment? How in the world should I treat my team members? Kathryn, that is the number one question I'm getting today.
and it's certainly a question that I'm receiving quite frequently as well. And it's a difficult question to answer because I think that most employers want to do the right thing, and by the right thing, meaning we want to keep people employed. But at the same time, if you happen to be in an industry like the hospitality industry, you don't have any business coming in right now. So how can you continue to keep people employed if you don't have the money in order to pay them? So ultimately, it's a decision that has to be made very on a fact by fact situation to look at your current circumstances with respect to the money you have coming in and what you're able to pay someone. Now, as I said, I do think that this law was primarily intended to provide some safety net for employees, because the fact is the government wants people to stay home today, and people can't stay home if they're not making money. And there's one of the provisions which we don't really talk about that much, but there is some unemployment provisions in the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, where it's going to make it a little bit easier for people to get unemployment if employers provide some additional information. Now, we don't have enough regulations out about that yet to say what employers need to do, but that is a component to this act as well.
Whenever we dive into the act, I'm reading things like FMLA. I'm reading different acronyms at this point. Can you give a little light for me and for the listeners on some of the specific provisions as you interpret them? Again, we know, friends, this is not legal advice. Let me say that again. This is not legal advice. This is educational purposes only. But as you read through this, Kathryn, what are some of these acronyms and what do they mean? And how do we interpret? I'm asking three questions, which is poorly done. I know that. But what do they mean? How do we interpret as business owners?
So the Family Medical Leave Act has been in existence since the early 90s, and this is a law that provides leave time, unpaid leave time, for employees who work for employers that have 50 or more employees. So it doesn't apply to every business, certainly not small businesses, but if you do have 50 or more employees, then you will need to provide that unpaid leave to an employee who has either a serious health condition or is caring for a member of their family with a serious health condition. So it is certainly true that the coronavirus, if someone has it, would have a serious health condition, or if they're caring for someone that has it, would be caring for someone with a serious health condition. So the Family Medical Leave Act requires you to provide 12 weeks of unpaid leave to employees who are eligible. And not every employee is eligible. They had to have worked at your company for 12 months. It doesn't need to be continuous. They had to have worked at least 1,250 hours in the last year. And they have to work at a location where there are at least 50 employees within a 75-mile radius. So that's been the law for some time. What this act that was just passed this past week changes is with respect to a provision they're calling Emergency Family Medical Leave Act time. And this opens up the Family Medical Leave Act to employees who have only worked at your company for 30 days. So they no longer have to fit in within that 12-month period, 1,250 hours. They get it if they've been there for 30 days. And it allows them to take leave in the instance of the situation where their kids no longer have school or childcare available to them. So in that situation, an employee can stay home. Now, the first 10 days are going to be unpaid under the Emergency Family Medical Leave Act. But once we get past those 10 days, there will be pay that is required. And the pay is going to be based on the person's regular rate of pay. And it's going to be 2/3 of the employee's regular rate of pay, with a cap of $200 per day or $10,000 total per employee. Now, and one thing I should have said at the very beginning, this particular act, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, it applies to employers with less than 500 people, which is a little bit odd. I'm not sure why they chose that number, but they did. So it's actually intended for smaller businesses, although it certainly encompasses some larger businesses. And when we're looking at those 500 employees, we're looking company-wide. It's not just at a location. And we likely are also going to be applying what's called the integrated employer test, which means that if you are a business owner and you have several businesses and there's common ownership and you meet, there's actually 4 prongs to this particular test, but you meet all 4 of those prongs, you're going to count all the employees that are employed by that single business owner.
What is, whenever I read the legislation, Kathryn, I'm seeing this, employers with less than 50 employees may be exempt. And then as I'm reading that exemption possibility, I read in your blog post where you said employers with less than 50 employees may want to assume the law will apply to them. And while simultaneously, I'm hearing things from the medical community, like the dental community, the ADA is trying to lobby against to try to make that they are exempt. What does all that mean, and how do business owners who fall in that criteria, how do they interpret all this at this point?
It's really difficult because we're doing everything so quickly. Normally, when a law gets passed, we have months and months of debate and input in terms of what needs to be in that law. And then we have a period of time where the Department of Labor would issue regulations. It's just, we don't have the time for that to take place today. So when the law itself says that employers under 50 may seek an exemption if they can show a hardship by applying with this law, it's hard to imagine an employer under 50 who couldn't show a hardship. So I have difficulty understanding where they're going to make that distinction, which is why we felt it best to say at this point, assume it applies to you until we have more information about what a hardship would entail. I'd hate for an employer to count on that hardship and end up getting into trouble by not doing what they were supposed to do because they didn't understand that they wouldn't actually apply for the hardship. With respect to the healthcare industry, throughout the act, there are exceptions made for healthcare workers. So, if you are working or have a company that's working in the healthcare industry, you really need to get individual advice because there are so many exceptions that were created simply because the nature of your work may not allow you to let people take off. And even though people certainly want to or need to, they may not be able to because of patient concerns.
So I guess my last question, I have 2 more questions, Kathryn. I know there's so much and we could talk for probably hours on this as just, I mean, again, you're a wealth of wisdom. Again, I appreciate you coming on the podcast today, but let me ask you this. Are there any penalties for business owners if they're ignorant or if they don't follow this rule as when it comes to paying for the emergency paid sick leave?
Yes, so the emergency paid sick leave is you would be penalized just as you would if you had not paid minimum wage under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So there would be monetary penalties in addition to I think it's usually 2 times the amount of what you would have to pay back. And unfortunately, ignorance is never an excuse. It's always just whether or not the law was broken. It doesn't matter if you didn't understand or your company tried to do what was right, but just ended up missing out on it, which is why it's always so important, to make sure that you're getting individual legal advice for your particular situation.
And I guess that leads me into my last question. And maybe the answer to the last question, that very last sentence you made is, what is that one piece of direction? I would say advice, but direction that you would give to business owners today with what you know in your head and what we're dealing with as a country? What's that one piece of direction that you would offer to business owners today?
I think it is imperative that if a plan's not in place, to get one in as quickly as possible. This law that we've been talking about actually doesn't go into effect until April 2nd. I think you have to sort of plan. Things are likely to get worse before they're going to get better. And so if you're already in a situation where it is imperative that you start laying off people, you may want to do that before this law goes into effect, because if you are in business after April 2nd and you're under 500 employees, you will have to comply with this, which means you're going to have to come up with paying people paid sick leave. And if you can't do that, you don't want to, like I said, you don't want to count on that exception because that could get you into trouble. So I think that companies really have to have a plan in place. For those companies who can have their employees work remotely, it needs to be taking place now because, my guess is as good as yours, but I'm thinking that we're going to see more shutdowns in the future. And so the better prepared you can be, the better off you're going to be.
Yeah, Kathryn, I think you're living that right now. In fact, I can hear your family, which is just makes me laugh, makes me smile that, here we are and you're living what you're describing there. I mean, you're working from home at this point, as so many of our business people and employees are nationally. So I think that's sage wisdom there. Let me ask you, Kathryn, if anybody had any follow-up questions, what's the best way for people to reach out? Maybe some clarity, maybe they do need some legal advice and they'd like to employ your services or your firm services. How would you direct people to that answer?
My email address is kcimera@lawmg.com. And that's the best way to get in touch with me. We are located in Indiana. I'm licensed in Indiana. So to the extent someone wants legal advice, I'm limited in terms of what I can provide on a states outside of Indiana.
That's great. I appreciate you again, once again, coming on the show, Kathryn. Friends, again, just for clarification purposes, this is not legal advice. This is education, as we always talk about on the show. But I think you can understand, even whenever you hear someone with Kathryn's experience, I mean, 20 years representing and working with business owners in this employment world, in the employment law world, you can even understand how fluid this situation is. So I'm going to challenge you to take a look at the blog article that Kathryn actually authored. I've been looking on the firm's blog. They have a great blog here. We'll share that in the show notes. Kathryn, once again, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, and good luck to everyone.
Hey guys, I realize that life is hard, but life is good. Life is good. This is okay. This too shall pass. And life can be frustrating. Money doesn't have to be. We're going to continue to make our lives at least financially simple. Y'all go out and make it. It's not going to happen unless you make it a great day.